Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Laurier series on inspiring conversations. This morning's talk and presentations will focus on addressing homelessness in our communities. So we would like to thank you for joining us for these inspiring conversations about addressing homelessness in our communities this morning. As we begin, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier's university campuses are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. In alignment with Laurier's strategic plan, the Inspiring Conversation series seeks to elevate a range of perspectives and ideas, including those of our Indigenous colleagues. The sharing of knowledge is powerful and a foundational step towards reconciliation. We are grateful to share this space where we can hear, speak to, and learn from one another. Perhaps this morning you're joining us from another location, and in that case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous people who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and water. Good morning once again. My name is Chris McEvoy. I'm currently the manager of Homelessness and Supportive Housing here at the Region of Waterloo. Myself and my team help coordinate various services and resources to help people find and maintain housing. And this includes street outreach services, emergency shelters throughout the region, homelessness prevention and diversion services, and most importantly, supportive housing. The format for today's event will start with hearing from our two panelists, and then we'll have an open conversation and dialogue about the ideas that they've shared, as well as your own questions. Throughout today's session, please feel free to pop your questions into the question box, the Q&A box within Zoom, and I'll pose them to our panelists later after they finish their presentations. So to begin the conversation this morning, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, Dr. Erin Dej and Dr. Laura Pinn. Dr. Erin Dej is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology at Wilfrid Laurier University. She brings over 10 years of experience and advocacy experience on homelessness, having been led by the lived experts she works with. Erin studies homelessness and social exclusion, including the criminalization of homelessness, most recently publishing her book, A Complex Exile, Homelessness and Social Exclusion in Canada. Also with us this morning is Dr. Laura Pinn, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her research examines how social inequality intersects with policy governance regimes and how political scientists can use community-engaged research to understand complex community problems. Laura has produced several reports for the National Housing Council and Employment and Social Development Canada. Currently, Laura is working on projects about civic engagement, housing policy, and municipal diversity and inclusion planning. Good morning, Laura. Good morning, Erin. Welcome to you both. Thanks for sharing your time with us this morning. So to kick things off, I'm going to turn things over to you, Erin, for our first presentation this morning.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chris. I am going to start by sharing my screen. There we go. Thank you to the organizers for providing myself and Dr. Pinn an opportunity to share our research with you. We want to leave lots of time for conversation. So I'm going to spend the first bit providing a lay of the land for understanding how we've reached the homelessness crisis we have in Canada. And then Laura will provide a deep dive on encampments specifically and policy responses to the growth of encampments over the last few years. Then we'll have a chance to speak with you all, which we're excited about. So let's start unpacking what we know about homelessness. In 2012, the homelessness sector developed the Canadian definition of homelessness. What's important about this definition that you're seeing here on the screen is that it points to the various causes of homelessness, including individual factors, but also systemic and structural causes of homelessness. The homelessness epidemic that we see today can't be caused by individuals simply making poor decisions in their lives. The crisis is too big, affects too many people, and has lasted for too long for that to be the only explanation. So this definition incorporates a broader understanding of the causes of homelessness. The definition also points to a continuum of homelessness that moves us beyond only thinking about that kind of absolute homelessness that we probably think about when we think about homelessness, and recognizes the different forms that homelessness takes. So you see on the right side of this image here, The first two kinds of homelessness are what we usually think of when we picture homelessness. It's people who are unsheltered, so who are living in public spaces like sidewalks or parks, or staying in encampments, or staying in places that we call unsafe for human habitation. And that's like sleeping in your car. Emergency sheltered is for people who are staying in the shelter system. The next two items on this list really broaden things out. Provisionally accommodated gets at people who have temporary, unstable housing, like people who might be staying on a friend's couch, so couch surfing, or people who will stay in a motel room until they run out of money and then are on the street. It can also refer to someone who has a roof over their head right now because they are, let's say, in the hospital or in jail, but who will be homeless when discharged. The last one, at risk of homelessness, is housing that is not suitable or safe. This is things like a home being overcrowded and not having enough places to sleep for the family composition. There are stories that have been put out recently in reports about, especially in housing on reserves and up north, people having to sleep in shifts because there aren't enough beds or rooms for the families to sleep. It also captures people who are facing eviction and housing that doesn't meet health and safety standards. For example, in a research project in Halifax that I was a part of, one of the women who was transitioning from homelessness to housing was looking at apartments. She looked at one unit and there was like mouse poop on the kitchen counter, so not great. But she was happy to see that mouse poop and was excited to take the unit because she said that a mice infestation meant it was less likely that there would be cockroaches and rats. So she moved her and her young daughter into that unit. That's the kind of housing situation that people are facing and what that at risk of homelessness criteria gets at. The image that you see here gets at those other two kinds of homelessness, what we call hidden homelessness. The image shows that while policy and programming is more likely to be focused on visible street homelessness, right, the person in the middle of this image, what we often don't see, and so because we don't see it, we often don't invest resources in, is helping people who are part of the hidden homeless. So this can include, for example, among other things, people who are stuck in situations of abuse or violence. So women have said that they would rather risk violence they know than potential violence on the street. It can include people who are couch surfing, like we've talked about, so staying with friends for as long as they can until they run out of options, or people that are in core housing need. So that's people who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, leaving them vulnerable should anything happen and they can't pay rent 1 month. To understand what's happening with homelessness right now, we can look at the numbers. So about 250,000 Canadians experience homelessness in a year. But this is absolutely an underestimate, as these numbers are pre-COVID numbers. And they also aren't able to capture that hidden homelessness that I just talked about. But using that 250,000 number that we do have available to us, that amounts to about 30,000 people who are homeless every night in Canada. Again, these are pre-pandemic numbers, but it's important to recognize that visible homelessness isn't the result of COVID alone. COVID didn't create visible homelessness. Even before the pandemic, at least 5,000 people were sleeping on the street every night in a country as affluent as Canada. Something I find really interesting to think about is that 15% of people who are homeless are what we call chronically homeless. So that means they've experienced homelessness for 6 months or more. What we also know is that a whopping 85% of people who experience homelessness experience it for a short period of time, usually about a month, and often experience it just once in their lives. This means that our understanding of who can become homeless and who is experiencing homelessness doesn't line up with what the data tells us. That actually lots of people experience homelessness at some point in their lives, usually due to a struggle to pay for housing and or a personal crisis. That said, that 15% of people who are chronically homeless, who are homeless for a long time, use more than 50% of homelessness services. So they often require increased support than the 85% of people who are homeless. So how did we get to this state? Because we haven't always had this homelessness crisis. After World War II, the federal government invested heavily in housing. They wanted to make sure soldiers had a home to come home to, and this continued for decades. So for example, in 1973, the federal government committed to building 20,000 units of low-income housing every year. And that continued for a decade, 20,000 units every year. At that time, the Ontario government also created financial assistance for renters and created rent control policies to make sure rents couldn't be increased too much or at any time. In the 1980s, we saw a steady decline in federal support for housing and a downloading of responsibility for housing from the federal government onto provinces and territories. In 1993, the federal government disinvested from housing completely. So from 1995 to 2002, the federal government built no new nonprofit housing. They left it to the private market to sort out affordable housing and put the responsibility onto provinces and territories. What we see here, though, in this graph is how few rentals, so rentals are the yellow line at the bottom, have been built in Ontario since 1990, since the federal government said, let's leave it to the private market to build that kind of rental housing. And this graph and this measure of rental units that were built doesn't even cover affordable rental units. This is just rental units at all. While this was happening, provinces, and especially Ontario in the 1990s, were cutting social assistance rates and reducing social supports. Meanwhile, minimum wage jobs stagnated, and as globalization took hold, there were fewer permanent stable jobs available. At the same time that all that was happening, those units that were built in the 60s and 70s, right, that 20,000 units a year, were now starting to age and falling into disrepair. So not only were we not building new units, but the reality is we've been losing the social housing units that we did have. In the 2000s, the provinces then downloaded responsibility for social housing onto municipalities. So the federal moved it to provincial and territorial, now provinces moved it to municipalities. But of all orders of government, municipalities have the least ability to generate income. So the federal and provincial governments can generate income using HST, so using income tax. But municipalities are only able to generate income through property taxes, which is a much smaller pot of money. In the 2010s, the federal and provincial governments started to make small investments back into social housing, very minimal compared to previous investments. And then in 2017, the federal government, to use their words, quote, came back to the table and committed to investing in affordable housing. This is very exciting and good news. Part of the National Housing Strategy is a plan to build 100,000 units of housing over the next 10 years, assuming provinces come on board. While this is great, it pales in comparison to the number of units built in the 70s and 80s. Meanwhile, our population is growing. This is the context for understanding homelessness in 2023. We see that homelessness is not natural or inevitable. Before the policy decisions made in the late 80s and 90s, homelessness was not the crisis that we have now. And as the homelessness crisis grows, we see it emerging in mid-sized cities, where before the last decade, homelessness wasn't as visible of an issue. although hidden homelessness certainly existed. Most of what we know about homelessness comes from major urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. But some of the ways that these cities respond to homelessness and the resources available just aren't the same and don't translate for mid-sized cities. In research I've been doing over the last 3 years, we've come to see how the narrative about homelessness in different mid-sized cities compared to big cities, where, for better or for worse, homelessness is expected there. COVID has magnified the visibility of homelessness in mid-sized cities. There has been a 60% increase in homelessness across Canada since COVID, and rough data suggests that this increase is happening in mid-sized cities who are facing visible homelessness sometimes for the first time. For example, Waterloo Region saw a 263% increase in homelessness over the course of the last 3 years. And in Newfoundland, homelessness rates quadrupled. This has had an impact on how people understand their communities. Seeing homelessness disrupts this image that many people have that these communities are these small, tight-knit spaces where people take care of each other. One of the narrative tools used in mid-sized cities across the country is the assumption that the homelessness they're seeing are from people who aren't from their community, that they've traveled to their community to access basic services. But the data does not support this claim. For example, in Waterloo Region, 88% of people who are homeless have lived in the region for more than 5 years. In Brantford, where I'm joining you today, 68% have lived in the city for more than 5 years. By and large, people who are homeless in these mid-sized cities are very much from here. There's a fictionalized account of how things used to be in many of these smaller cities, and the suggestion that these no longer small towns can return to a time when they didn't have to bear witness to homelessness. This narrative needs to be broken if we're going to see momentum towards preventing and ending homelessness in these communities. This seems like a good place to turn it to Dr. Pin to explore encampments in mid-size and other cities.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Erin. I really appreciate you talking about the systemic governmental policy contributions and ultimately failures that have contributed to the significant increase that are not only our community in Waterloo Region, but other communities across Ontario, Canada, and North America see with regard to homelessness. It helps reshape that narrative that you were speaking about. So thank you very much. Just a quick reminder for everybody, there is a Q&A button within Zoom. And so we'd encourage you, as you hear these presentations, please type into that Q&A chat. And once Laura's finished her presentation, we will open it up for discussion and we'll take some of those questions for dialogue. But so just a quick reminder on Q&As. And until we do that, Laura, I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to take a moment now to share my screen, and it's going to work very smoothly. It's all going to go well. Oh, look at that. Okay. So thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks to everyone for making time to be here as well, all of the folks who are watching this webinar. And thanks, Erin, for setting the stage in terms of talking about some of the general aspects and characteristics of homelessness in Canada. I'm going to talk about a specific manifestation of homelessness, encampments, and incorporate some aspects of a human rights lens into the conversation. So I think most of us have a common sense kind of definition of encampments, but just to sort of reiterate, unsheltered homelessness is not new. However, in recent years, a crisis of housing affordability coupled with declines in the social support network, declines that Erin talked about, have led to the growing visibility of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, that is, people who don't have a roof over their heads, people who are sleeping rough. And encampments are any area where an individual or a group of people live in homelessness together, often in tents or in other temporary structures. As I mentioned, encampments themselves aren't new. in Canada. However, the number of encampments and the scale of some of these encampments, so the number of people in them, has increased in recent years in the Canadian context in municipalities of all sizes. So why do people end up living in encampments? And I want to push back against the choice narrative a bit here, that living in an encampment is the result of an individual choice between meaningful or appropriate housing options. Rather, the research suggests that people end up in encampments precisely because of a lack of choice. There are a number of push factors that push people away from other options and pull factors that draw people in towards encampments. I'm just going to focus on a few here. First, and quite obviously, the absence of affordable and appropriate housing options for individuals. And although this sounds straightforward, it can actually be quite complex. For example, different levels of government have different ways that they define affordability. And what might be deemed affordable in government policy might not be affordable for someone on a very low or fixed income, someone in receipt of social assistance who has a shelter allowance of only about $500 a month. Second, too few shelter spaces. So in some communities, shelters may be full or nearly full. People may line up for a bed and not get one. In one of the communities that I worked on housing and homelessness in for a number of years, there was no male shelter at all. So adult men did not have an emergency shelter at all in that community. So shelter spaces for those individuals were entirely absent. And third, shelter spaces may not be accessible. So for example, in a given community on a given night, maybe there are youth spaces available, but it's an adult woman looking for shelter. Shelter spaces may be unable to accommodate couples. They may not be able to accommodate pets. They may not work for people who use substances. And importantly, emergency shelters are congregate settings. They're settings where you sleep in a space with a bunch of strangers. And that may be difficult or impossible for people with specific trauma histories as well. So some of the push factors that push people towards encampments. In terms of some of the pull factors, I don't want to romanticize encampments at all, but research with people who live in encampments does report that there is a sense of community in terms of relationships and mutual respect and care with others living in the encampment that does create a sense of safety and trust for folks, especially in comparison to some of the other options they may have. Some of this sense of safety and trust is ironically created by some stability. So in terms of shelters, folks may need to line up every night for a bed. They may not get one. In terms of shelters, people generally need to leave during the day. So you may be able to be there from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m., but those 12 hours during the day, you have to go somewhere else. And encampments aren't governed by these rules. And this helps create a greater sense of autonomy, individual autonomy over housing, over decisions about where they want to be in space for folks that live in encampments. And I want to point out that two of these push factors, so too few emergency shelter spaces and shelter spaces that aren't accessible, addressing these is important, but it doesn't address homelessness because staying in an emergency shelter is a continuation of homelessness. Importantly, the presence of encampments in Canada is the example of a failure of a human rights approach to housing, and I want to talk about that briefly. While encampments have been growing, concurrently, the importance of a human rights approach to housing has been increasingly recognized in domestic law in Canada, as well as internationally. And I'll just talk about domestically. So domestically, while the right to housing is not enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it is in federal legislation via the National Housing Strategy Act of 2019, which commits the government to, quote, the progressive realization of the right to housing. Furthermore, court cases in British Columbia and recently in Waterloo region have read the right to housing as part of the Section 7 Charter rights to life, security of person, and so on. In international law, the right to housing is part of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, which are two treaties to which Canada is a signatory. So what does this actually mean? Among other things, a rights-based approach means recognizing that all people, including people experiencing homelessness, have a right to shelter. And building on some of what Erin said, in many ways, I would suggest that municipalities, in terms of encampments, have all of the responsibility with very little of the power. So municipalities are the predominant level of government responsible for responding to encampments on a day-to-day basis. However, many of the policy decisions structuring the availability and affordability of housing are the result of decisions made at the provincial and federal levels of government, and they are decisions over which municipalities have little control. In terms of how municipalities respond to encampments, municipalities act as service providers. So the chart on this page shows that spending on service provisioning in relation to homelessness has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. Municipalities directly provide or fund not-for-profits providing outreach services, food access, so on. Municipalities also act as bylaw enforcers, with bylaw officers often tasked with enforcing bylaws and or addressing other violations of municipal codes in relation to encampments. And third, and in some ways, really crucially, municipalities often serve as mediators of the use of public space, negotiating different demands on public space, including the use of space by encampment residents. So trying to manage concerns of people who live in neighborhoods, concerns of people who are advocates, concerns of people who are experiencing homelessness, trying to mediate between these different concerns and find a pathway forward. It's tough to be a municipality. And so municipal responses to encampments are incredibly important, and they can be a matter of life and death for unhoused residents who rely on encampments for food, water, healthcare access, shelter, and support. And there's a few different types of municipal responses. There's different typologies in the research literature. The one that I'll talk about is clearance without support, clearance with support, tacit acceptance, and sanctioning. And here's an example of some municipalities that have adopted different responses. And I just want to note that these examples are taken from November 2021. And so some municipalities may have adjusted their responses since then. So first, we have clearance with little or no support, where the response of the municipality is to remove encampment residents with little to no advance notice. And we've got the way that Brantford was responding to encampments in November 2021 as an example of that. Second, we have clearance with support, which is similar in that there's a focus on removing the encampment residents. However, in this case, there's more notice given and workers are often present to assist with referrals or long-term storage of belongings. And we have Hamilton's response at this time as an example of that. And the third example I'll give is one of tacit acceptance, where the encampment's not necessarily sanctioned by law. However, there's no policy of removal. So in the absence of an immediate safety concern, residents will not be asked to leave. Rather, outreach services will attend to the site and work with residents to provide supports and as well as explore housing options. And the last response, of which there's very few examples in Canada, one example might be a Better Tent City in Waterloo region, is sanctioning when encampments are actually explicitly permitted by law, and some infrastructure support is provided by the municipality. So just to conclude, I want to talk about a few key takeaways. One key takeaway is that I think it is really important to integrate a human rights approach into municipal encampment responses. And I think there's more work that can be done in that area. And recent court rulings have found that the clearance of encampments from public lands is a human rights violation when sufficient and accessible shelter spaces are unavailable. And so, going back to some of the different responses we've seen, I think thinking about how those responses can be adjusted to be consistent with this recent court ruling, as well as integrate a human rights approach, is important. Second, a need to involve encampment residents in making decisions concerning encampment residents in terms of harm reduction, in terms of mitigating concerns. So thinking about ways to really connect outreach workers, service providers with encampment residents, and to respect that these spaces are people's housing, albeit inadequate and non-permanent, right, in a lot of ways. And third, to recognize that encampments are not a substitute for permanent, affordable, and accessible housing. So as I mentioned, the existence of encampments in and of itself is in a lot of ways a policy failure in Canada. And of course, the goal is not to have better encampments, but to eliminate encampments in some ways through having everybody able to access permanent, affordable, and accessible housing, which is truly what the realization of the right to housing looks like. So I'm going to end it there, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll leave it to Chris to walk us through the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Lots of really good, rich information there, and also as very similar to Erin's presentation around the complexity of homelessness with regard to encampments, the different push-pull factors. I appreciated your insights on what may encourage or drive someone towards an encampment, but also pull them potentially away from. So thanks, that's really helpful. And also just would want to underscore as you shared in one of your last slides there, the importance of lived and living experience in influencing program, system, and policy decisions. Would just echo that importance to be able to co-develop and consult with people with lived experience. That makes a really big difference when implementing policy and program and systems change. So just a quick reminder for everybody who's on today's session, there is still the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom meeting room. And so if you have a question that comes up, please type it in there, and happy to direct questions this afternoon. So we've got about 29 minutes left. I'm going to start with a question that came through the chat, 2 questions around basic income. And so I'm going to read both of the questions verbatim, share a bit of my thoughts and insights, and then Laura and Erin, I'll turn things over to you. So 2 questions around basic income. One was, I'm interested in hearing how a basic income can help reduce homelessness, as well as another question that said, do you think a basic income guarantee indexed to the cost of living in the local community would reduce homelessness? So my short answer to that is yes. One of the root causes that we know that impacts and contributes significantly to experiences of homelessness is that of affordability and the lack of supply of affordable housing. When we in our community see consistently increasing rents and mortgage and the cost of living increase, stagnant social assistance rates, low vacancy rates, all of those things are contributing to a housing and a rental market that are unaffordable for a significant portion of our population. So my answer is yes, housing affordability is one of the root system causes that lead and drive homelessness. So in short, yes, but there's some additional kind of context and answers there. Laura and Erin, any insights from yourselves around basic income and its ability to address homelessness?
I can jump in if that's okay, and then I'll pass it over to you, Erin. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. And I agree with you, Chris. One of the great tragedies of the cancellation, so you may remember there was a basic income pilot in Ontario that was canceled in something like 2016, I think 2015, whenever the election was, and the Conservative, there was a change in government and they decided they didn't want to do that. But there was some research that was done around that basic income pilot that demonstrated significant improved outcomes for individuals in terms of their health and well-being, their stability, their ability to access educational opportunities, people who were receiving that basic income in comparison with social assistance recipients. And part of the reason was that basic income was actually set at a scant but livable level. And that's how I would describe it. It was about $2,000 a month, whereas right now ODSP is $1,200 and Ontario Works is something like $780. And so folks were actually, a major contributor, in my view, to episodic homelessness is that when you are trying to survive on $780 or $1,200 a month, you have no margin for error. Something goes wrong, you have a health crisis, you have an unexpected expense, and you can very quick, it's very easy for you to lose your housing. And in fact, in research I've done, about 80% of folks who are experiencing homelessness, I found, I'll be curious to know Erin's numbers on this, are people who also receive social assistance. And so the inadequacy of those programs right now is a factor that makes people really vulnerable to potentially experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, I completely agree with both Chris and Laura. Again, we had some research before the program cut. I actually think it was like 2018. I think time is 2017, 2018. So we were starting to see what the results were, but because the Ford government cut the pilot, we don't know. What I am going to drop in the chat, though, is an amazing piece by a photographer called Jesse Gollum, who did a photo sort of look documentary at people who had received basic income and the impact that it had on their lives. So please check that out. It's really powerful, and I always return to it. I think there's a couple of things here. When we talk about the fact that 85% of people who experience homelessness experience it usually because of housing unaffordability, and for that short period of time, it's not only people who are homeless, it's people who are precariously housed, that at risk of homelessness, right? That if we can catch them, that's really where universal basic income can help, because it can provide, as Laura just described, right, that bit of a buffer, that if something happens, and by something happens, I know people who are homeless whose glasses broke, and they told me they couldn't afford like the Shoppers Drug Mart, those glasses, right? Like so they went without seeing. I know somebody who uses a wheelchair and their wheelchair broke, and ODSP wouldn't cover the cost to fix it because it wasn't within the time frame where you were allowed to get a cost fix. And so like that's the kind of thing we're talking about how something can happen in people's lives, and it can just, if they were precariously housed, can lead them into homelessness. The other thing I will say, though, is that on its own, universal basic income can't eliminate homelessness, because it is still working with the market rent, which we know keeps rising and rising and rising. And so while I think that universal basic income can support, especially again, people who are on the margins, people who are precariously housed, we need to invest in social housing. We need to invest in a housing that doesn't have to sort of keep up with these ridiculous rental costs in order for people to afford a place to live.
Excellent. Thank you both. Really, really appreciate your insights. As you were both speaking, the other piece that I would echo and maybe build on is the upstream and preventative work that is so important for people to maintain their housing. When we talk about experiences of homelessness or chronic homelessness or visible homelessness, and you both touched on this throughout your presentations, there are a number of individuals who face hidden homelessness or housing precarious, who are precariously housed. And they're, like you say, one glasses repair, one car breakdown away from an experience of homelessness. And so anything that we as a society and our systems can do to ensure that people can maintain their housing and that stability is incredibly important. So I'll move us to the next question. I see Mike here has put in the Q&A, has homelessness increased as a result of addicts or mentally ill individuals not being rehabilitated or hospitalized in institutions? It seems like the unsheltered homeless fester on the fringes of society without benefit of any real supports. So I'm happy to share my insights and then turn things over to you, Laura and Erin. Great question, Mike. And I think you're touching on one of the other root causes of homelessness is health, whether it be physical health or mental health or addictions challenges. We know that that can be paired with an experience of homelessness. And so when we talk previously to the Q&A, or the last question around affordability, it's not just about the bricks and mortars and making sure that a place somewhere is affordable. It's ensuring that if someone needs it, those wraparound supports, whether they be health, mental health, addictions, to ensure that someone can thrive and be sustainably housed and supported in that unit. That's where supportive housing, whether it's fixed site, a dedicated building to supportive housing, or scattered site market units that are paired with a supplement or subsidy with some supports, are incredibly important in our community and others in addressing homelessness. So the health aspects of an individual's experience sometimes directly contributes to homelessness or prolonging an experience of homelessness. So addressing homelessness requires not only a response from housing system partners and funding, but other systems, other levels of government, whether we talk about corrections or health institutions. It does require that systems approach to make sure we're serving and supporting whole people. Those are my thoughts and responses. Erin, Laura, turn things over to you for any insights that you have.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I think the emphasis on wraparound services is an important one. So I have a few thoughts. One is, yes, deinstitutionalization in the 1970s and 1980s was complicated, especially because there often were not sufficient community supports in place, right, for folks that had complex health needs. At the same time, everything that has been written about the use of institutional and involuntary institutionalization, like, it's very concerning from a disability perspective. I could direct you towards the Huronia project that's talked, as a research project that talks about some of those experiences. So I guess what I would say is, from a human rights perspective, talking about access to housing as a right means that there's not conditions, right? And so people don't have to be perfect individuals. They don't have to fulfill some ideal. Everyone has the right to housing. And to meet that right, we have to meet people where they are at, which might sound really idealistic because it's very different. We usually think about accessing stuff through a mentality of you get what you can pay for, right? I'm in the kind of housing right now that I can afford, that I can pay for through a capitalist system. But treating housing as a human right means moving away from that and saying people, regardless of ability to pay, should have access to some sort of housing, right? And that housing should meet basic criteria of safety, of adequacy, and so on. And so I think, incorporating a disability justice lens, as well as incorporating the reality that many people who experience homelessness, yes, they do use substances, and that creates stigma and creates complexities in the housing search. I think we have to be aware of those things. But I still think that doesn't affect someone's, again, a human rights approach means that you don't have to deserve housing. You automatically deserve housing because everybody deserves housing because you're a human being.
That's great. I echo Laura's comments. I think I'll just add, sort of taking on the perspective of the healthcare needs of people who are experiencing homelessness. First of all, when we go back to that, that's why I love that stat so much about 85% of people experiencing homelessness are experiencing it for 1 month. And lots of those folks are not experiencing debilitating mental health challenges or substance use issues. And so when we think about who's experiencing homelessness, part of that is recognizing the plethora of people, the different kinds of people who are experiencing homelessness. I've also encountered lots of people, and it's available in the research as well, who were not struggling with a severe mental illness, or were not using what for lack of a better term, like hard drugs, before becoming homeless. And it is the experience of being in homelessness and the degradation and the dehumanization that comes with being homeless that leads them to experiencing trauma. I mean, for lack of a better word. In a survey of youth who are experiencing homelessness in Canada, 40% of youth experiencing homelessness in Canada experienced it for the first time before they were 16 years old. So children are experiencing homelessness. And so when we think about that image we have of people who are homeless, I encourage us to recognize how much of it is the homelessness systems that we've created, or the lack of systems that we've created that are contributing to or making it incredibly difficult to heal from some of the traumas that people are experiencing.
I just want to say that's such a good point, in that homelessness creates disability. It's debilitating, right? It can create, it's hazardous to your health. It's not like it's a dynamic relationship between disability and homelessness, for sure.
I am the biggest square you will ever meet. I don't, and having spent enough time in homeless spaces and around people who are homeless, I am convinced, I know that if I became homeless, I would start using substance. 100%. I know I would, because it would be the only way to have a break from that survival mode, to escape for just a moment when things are so difficult and so horrible. So I become very clear to me over my decade of doing this work that substance use is actually not so much the issue. It's the systems around it.
Thanks for underscoring and going back to that, Erin. Yeah, we know from research, literature, and living firsthand experiences that inherently the experience of homelessness is traumatic in and of itself and leads to and causes those mental health and health challenges that you're both speaking to. So it's part of that narrative switch that we and other communities need to take on to continue to challenge our existing narratives of what is homelessness, what is chronic homelessness, and what causes it, from an individual failing and failure in choices to one of systemic failings of community and society. And it really does take an all of community approach to end homelessness. So next, I'm going to go to a question from Blaine. And so maybe Laura and Erin, I'll take you off the hot seat for this one. But if you have any insights afterward, or if you have any insights to respond to, let me know. There's a question from Blaine that says, there's a large piece of land in Waterloo, formerly the Manulife property across from the police station at Columbia and Weber. It has not been occupied for years. There's transit and access to many services. Would this be a suitable location for a temporary encampment? So what I can say in my role as the manager of housing, or homelessness and supportive housing at the region, is we are constantly looking at and for available land, most significantly for affordable housing and the development of affordable housing, knowing that that will address the root cause and is the answer to homelessness, but also for other sites and services and places like transitional housing, interim housing, emergency shelters. Throughout the pandemic, and this was back in the fall of 2022, myself and my team looked back, we had opened over 14 temporary emergency shelter or interim housing locations since the beginning of the pandemic. So in September of 2022, that was one every 2 months. So we used different hotels and motels and student residences, as well as faith-based organizations, gymnasiums, a YMCA very early in the pandemic. So we are constantly evaluating options of both land and facilities. And the two pieces that I would maybe point to as regional strategic priorities, one is the Building Better Future program that housing services in the region are taking on to build 5,000 new affordable housing units within 5 years. Previously, the goal was 50 new units a year, and that has been increased by a tenfold to 500 new units a year. And maybe in a minute, I will drop a link into the chat that shares a dashboard of that Building Better Futures, where we are at with regard to completing our goal of those 5,000 units. So we are constantly undergoing a search for places and spaces and land through Building Better Futures, but also through interim housing solutions. So back in August of 2022, Regional Council supported a staff motion and recommendation to increase shelter spaces, to increase transitional housing spaces, including an Indigenous-led and determined transitional housing program, as well as expansion of supportive housing through scattered site supportive housing in the community. So we're in the midst of doing that through places like the King Street Shelter in Kitchener, as well as the Herbs Road shelter in Waterloo that will be opening as soon as we can, because we know when we see that the challenges persist in our community in terms of folks living in encampments and wanting to support them to come in from outside into emergency shelter, transitional spaces, again, but ultimately with housing as the end goal and solution to experiences of homelessness. So I'll pause in case Laura, Erin, you have any questions or comments or anything to share around land. Okay, I'll move us on. So I do want to get to a question a little further down in the chat, and I'm just going to keep talking to find it. There it is. So an anonymous attendee asked a question, do you have suggestions for what citizens can do about this crisis? So what can a community member do to contribute positively towards helping people end their experience of chronic homelessness, or helping our community or our system enhance and improve? Laura, Erin, maybe I'll turn things over to you to start.
Yeah, I can start with that one. I love that question. Thank you so much for asking it. I think there's lots of things people can do. I think I see it as 3 tiers. So the first tier is get involved, volunteer at, homeless serving agencies, or get involved with organizations that support people who are homeless. Be active in city councils as they make these decisions. But I also, so that's I love that answer. I would love if everybody did that, but I also recognize we're all humans. I'm very tired at the end of the day. I have kids to run around. So I understand that that's not always possible for everybody at all times. So if that tier is too high, then the next tier I would really encourage people to do is and it seems so silly, but it really is true. Be kind to people who are homeless. I have had so many folks who are homeless tell me that somebody smiling, that somebody saying hello, even if you know, you don't have to give the money if you don't want to give them money, but just literally acknowledging that somebody has spoken is huge. And people really recognize people who are homeless are treated so inhumanely so often that a little bit of humanity goes a long way. And then the third tier is, even if that's not feeling doable for you, even if that's not something you can do, my ask is that people don't get in the way. So it's okay if you can't take on homelessness, if this isn't like, but simply don't stop organizations and municipalities who are trying to do something. So if a building is going to be built in your neighborhood, let the building be built. If they're going to provide, resources to folks who are homeless, like just let that happen. Honestly, not fighting it is an incredibly helpful tool as well. So that's what I would say.
Excellent. Thanks, Erin. So I'm going to move us on. We're in our final 9 minutes here. So I'm going to get one more question in and then our final question. So maybe Laura, I'll pose to you, just scrolling here. So if there's a serious shortage of housing, no matter what one's financial resource, there is no housing. How does a guaranteed income solve that? Together, maybe with another question Carol asked. So how do we make sure that the new housing that is being built is truly affordable?
Yeah, those are both great questions. And so I would reiterate, going back to what Erin said as well, a basic income, I think, is part of a solution. I think it would be a better system than the social assistance system we have in place. In and of itself, it wouldn't fully address the housing crisis, and particularly the housing crisis of affordability. So in terms of the shortage of housing and, these questions of how do we ensure that new housing is affordable, I would say, and I think this is a point that's been appreciated by academic researchers, by government to some extent. Scotiabank, a few weeks ago, a bank even released a report about this, and I'll drop it in the chat, that we need to grow the non-market housing sector. And what that means is that we need more affordable housing. Because private market housing is often treated as an investment by the folks involved with it in various ways, the private market hasn't been able to meet that need for affordability, and in particular, deep affordability. And so we need to look at different strategies for addressing that, be it social housing built by the provincial and federal levels of government, be it cooperative housing, and a lot of not-for-profits are looking at cooperative housing, be it something like community land trusts, which different communities are adopting to help preserve the supply of affordable housing. So one of the big issues is that this approach of just build more housing and that will address the affordability issue doesn't take into consideration the heterogeneity of different people experiencing affordability crises, a chunk of whom are not going to benefit from new condos or new builds. And it also doesn't take into consideration the displacement effects. So producing new builds, and when I was living in Toronto downtown, this was a big problem. You'd have more units coming in, new units, but it would involve destroying the existing building that might have been a rooming house that was providing affordable housing for 20 people who are never going to be able to live in that new building. And so for all these reasons, I think real attention to building up that non-market dimension of our housing regime is really crucial in addressing affordability in a meaningful way.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Just going to scroll through the questions here. Lots of great ones. So my apologies. We're not going to be able to get through all of your questions in today's session. Just going to look for one or two last here. Interesting one maybe on rural homelessness. So looking at maybe both of you, one of you for a response. Sandra asks, what are the challenges with regard to rural homelessness? And what's being done either in our community or others to help people stay in their home communities?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I did a project in a rural, we called it a semi-rural because there were 2 towns one of about 40,000 and one of about 5, but a lot of it was rural. And so I can speak a little bit to some of those challenges. One is that because homelessness, I think, is less recognized as a problem in rural communities, there tend to be less resources available. So as I mentioned, in this particular community, there were 2 shelters, none of which took adult men, which was a major problem. In addition, there was only 1 youth shelter and 1 shelter for women and families. And if you, sometimes people were not permitted to go to those shelters. They had past conflict with staff, and so there wasn't another option in the community. So that was a challenge as well, just the limited resources. Another challenge for folks was just very limited rental housing stock. Often, affordable rentals being limited to a couple buildings in a community, maybe owned by the same landlord. Maybe that landlord has a reputation of not taking great care of those units. And so real challenge to find like adequate housing, just in terms of the fact that you have communities where 80% of the housing stock is single detached family dwellings, as opposed to larger cities like Waterloo, where you have a greater proportion of apartments and multi-unit dwellings. Maybe I'll turn over to Erin to ask if she's got anything to add.
Just really briefly, I echo this, and what we're seeing happen in mid-sized communities, but I think I've also heard about it happening in rural communities, is there are communities with no shelters, right? Like 0 shelters. So they'll say, we don't have homelessness, because look, and it's, well, that's the hidden homelessness piece. And so then if they build, whether it's a shelter or some kind of drop-in or whatever, that's when they get, well, look, they're not from here. Look at all these people using this service. We never had homelessness before. Now we've built the service, and there's people using this service. It must be people from out of town who've come to use that one service. And that's just truly not the case. Those folks were always there, struggling in a big way, and they're grabbing onto that lifeline of whatever new service a rural community might provide. So breaking that narrative that we hear is a really tricky part of addressing rural homelessness. But I think we need to name it and work through it.
Excellent. Thank you both. So in our final few minutes here, I'll acknowledge that I believe my role as the moderator is kind of twofold, is to keep us on track and on time, and to ensure rich dialogue. And so I'm going to fail on the keeping us on time in the spirit of continuing with this really great dialogue. So we may go a few minutes over 12:30. So my apologies. If you do have to jump off, thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. I see that over 119 people were here, I think, at its peak. So just really appreciate it. So we've talked a lot today about the challenges with regard to homelessness, not only at a community level, but also societal and policy systemic challenges. I'm interested to hear from you both, Laura and Erin. What gives you hope? What are you seeing that are the bright spots that is cause and reason for hope, either in our community or larger? What are you hopeful about?
119 people here, I think, is hopeful for sure. I think that there is greater public attention on this issue and greater public concern. And I think folks, in their communities are actively pushing elected officials to be more accountable for the decisions that they're making and to take action. Because, homelessness and housing affordability is an issue that touches us all in some way or another.
Yeah, I will be honest. I have days where I don't have a lot of hope. I have bad days where I'm like, I'm not sure, but then there's always something that happens that gets me out of bed, and that gives me hope again. And so much of it is honestly learning and hearing about people who are not deep. I spend my whole life, I spend every day, every waking hour almost thinking about this and working on this. And then I meet somebody who this isn't a big part of their life, but they're like, oh, I saw this person today and I gave them $20. Or, oh, I walked by an encampment and I made some sandwiches. And I'm like, you haven't devoted your life to this, but you recognize it and have done something. And that gives me tremendous hope. I do think one of the silver linings of COVID, whereas COVID has done all sorts of really horrible stuff, one of the silver linings is that it made, I think, some people recognize how close we all are to potentially becoming homeless, that it doesn't have to be a certain type of person that may become homeless. And so I hope that we can continue to build on that empathy that we can now see for folks and recognize that we all have a part to play. I will also say my students give me an incredible amount of hope. They're wonderful. And I don't like to say youth are the future, because I feel like that lets us adults off the hook a little bit, but I do love these students, and I think they're going to go on and do great things.
Excellent. Thank you both for your responses and measured in your level of hope. And yeah, it's not always it's not glamorous work or topic, and it's a really challenging, complex one, as I think we've heard throughout this conversation. So really appreciate both of your times here today, your presentation, your thoughtful responses, and your work in the background to increase the level of education and awareness with students and with the greater community. So lots of gratitude. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Erin, for spending time today. So I'll bring us to a bit of a wrap up in closing, recognizing that we're at time at 12:30. Lots of gratitude to people who have came and attended today. And I hope you have learned something, you've taken something away today. You are maybe challenged yourself or challenging yourself to find ways to contribute, to make a difference, whether big or small. So thank you, gratitude, and I hope you have something to take away from today. My brief thought on hope is very much the same as yours, Erin, is that throughout the pandemic, one of the silver linings has been the amount of attention and frankly, resources that the federal, provincial, and municipal governments have put on this issue. It's not just a lot of talk and spotlighting. There are significant amount of financial resources going into not only the current response to new emergency shelter beds, new outreach services to support people who have a need right now, but also strategic investments in the solutions to end homelessness and chronic homelessness, in affordable housing, in transitional housing to support people to work and to move on the next step on their housing journey. So in wrapping up, just again, to thank you to all who have attended, listed, and posted questions. We'll be sending the link to recording as well as upcoming conversations in the next few days. I believe we'll also be posting contact information for Laura and for Erin if you have any questions, follow-up questions or comments for them. I'll end with a thank you. Thank you once again for coming and participating today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.